Hello class and welcome back to Sketch Science. Today we're going over a little something called the nitrogen cycle. Now, before we went over water, we went over carbon. There's one more we have to do, one more cycle, one more circle that's dedicated to all of life and how it works. Now, the first part of the nitrogen cycle. What is nitrogen? Nitrogen is a gas. It's often an N. In the air, it's an N2, like our oxygen is O2. Carbon dioxide could be CO2. Nitrogen sits in the air. Nitrogen actually makes up a fairly large portion of our air. How much do you think nitrogen might make up? 20%? 40%? 60%? The answer is actually closer to 80% of the air we breathe is nitrogen. It's actually 78, but we'll round it up to 80 because it's a large number. Most of the air we breathe, I know everyone talks about how we use oxygen, we breathe out CO2, but the gas that's most in our air around us is actually nitrogen. Now, what does that mean for us? Well, not a lot. We use nitrogen for a lot of things, but it means nothing when we breathe it in. That's why we need the nitrogen cycle. The first step of that is taking that nitrogen from the air. And how is that done? Through bacteria. Bacteria take the nitrogen out of the air. So if you've got all these little nitrogens floating up in the air, and you've got your ground here, there's little bacteria in the ground that pull that nitrogen down. And they use it, they fixate it into usable things like ammonia, like nitrates for plants to use. It turns all of this nitrogen into different nitrates for plants to use, different ammonia. Now, another way, it's not just bacteria that can do this. If you've ever heard of lightning strikes can also take back nitrogen and send it into the soil. If you've ever noticed, after a big rain or lightning storm, grass and other plants seem to grow a lot faster. And that's because lightning takes that nitrogen and shoots it into the ground in such a large amount that it's like natural fertilizer. It energizes all that plants with all the new nitrogen. Now, after the plants use this nitrogen, they take it up the stem into the leaves. Plants take nitrogen, they use it kind of like with photosynthesis, how they make other sugars and different things. Plants make things with nitrogen as well, different carbohydrates and stuff. They use that nitrogen, and those plants that pull the nitrogen out of the soil, nitrogen, ammonia, all these little things that are in the soil, they go up into the plant from the bacteria, go into the leaves, get made into things that can be used as nutrients. Amino acids is one of the examples. Now, after it's done that, the plants, as you know, with the circle of life, food chain, food web, that stuff we went over before, it gets eaten, like with the carbon cycle. It gets eaten by some kind of animal. It gets eaten by some kind of animal. Now, when that happens, that nitrogen, those amino acids are passed along. We use nitrogen in our DNA. We use it in proteins. We use nitrogen in a lot of different things when we eat it. Well, what happens to that nitrogen? Well, it can get passed along like carbon. It can get passed along like water. Anything that you have in your body or any living thing has in its body can get passed on through being eaten by something else. But what happens if something dies? If that rabbit, without being eaten, just falls over and dies, what happens to the nitrogen? Well, just like with the carbon, it gets broken down. You have your decomposers. Decomposers break down the living things, or the dead things actually. They don't break down living. They break down dead things back into the soil. That includes nitrogen. So not just carbon gets put back in the soil. All that nitrogen that's now inside this body gets returned back into the soil. And then it can go back into the plants. It can go back into the bacteria. It can then also, if it goes to the bacteria, it can be released back into the air. That's how nitrogen can move through. It can move from the air into the ground, and in the ground into bacteria to be processed, turned into something that plants can use. The plants use it. Once the plants use it, they're eatable. We can eat a plant. Any animal can eat a plant. Animals can pass it on after being eaten as well. Then when things die, that nitrogen gets broken down by decomposers back into the soil. And then from the soil, bacteria or plants can either take that and use it for themselves again to restart that, or send it back into the air. So nitrogen can go from the air to the soil through bacteria, through lightning. It can go into the soil through bacteria or lightning. It gets carried into plants. It gets sent into animals. Animals can die. And then it gets sent back into the soil through bacteria and decomposers. And then from the soil, it can go back into that bacteria. It can either go back to the plant or it can go up into the air. That is how the nitrogen cycle works. So like with carbon, there's multiple stages with combustion, different things, different branches it can take that way. It's the same with nitrogen. Nitrogen, you have this inner cycle here, but you also have this outer cycle of you have it going into the soil and coming out of the soil back into the air. So you've got this cycle going of from the air to the ground back to the air, but you also have this inner cycle of from the ground to the plant, from the plant to the animal, from the animal to the decomposer, from the decomposer to the ground to the plant, from the plant to the animal. You have that inner cycle and then the outer cycle of going from the air to the ground, from the ground to the air. Usually it goes from the air to the ground into the plant and then through the inner cycle and then back out, but it can go. Bacteria can send that nitrogen back from the ground to the air right away. So you have almost two wheels going at the same time, one inside of the other. That is the nitrogen cycle in a nutshell. Now, if you have any questions about this or want to know more, as always, be sure to like the video, leave a comment down below, and subscribe. So you don't miss any videos, you can find the videos quicker, and I know how to get videos out to you easier, what kind of videos you want to watch. So be sure to do those three things, and I will see you next time.